Hello friends and welcome to Blossom Acres. Today we are going to be in the kitchen making sourdough. That's right, beginner sourdough loaf that anyone can make. Because if I can make it, you can make it. One of the questions that I get a lot is like, why do you bother making sourdough? Well, for me, being a little bit gluten intolerant, the fermentation process of sourdough actually makes it easier for me to digest bread, so it doesn't upset my stomach, whereas regular bread would. As with a lot of bread recipes, you can make them vegan, vegetarian, you can fit many diet lifestyles by using sourdough bread or even regular bread. Now the sourdough starter I got actually came from Baker Creek. It came in a little envelope and it came with this card. It was just a little powdered baggie. It looked maybe like paper pieces where they had dehydrated sourdough starter and I had to rehydrate it. Now I do say that I really liked their sourdough starter. I know that you could start them just by using the air in your household for free, but I did like this option because I didn't know anything about sourdough starters. So it was an easy way for me to do it with minimal cost. I will say the one thing I don't like about the Baker Creek sourdough starter is that this is not a lot of information. It comes with like 5 paragraphs of information and 1 recipe, which I've never got this recipe to work. So, not the best. But the sourdough starter itself is really strong and it works great. So now we are going to be feeding our sourdough starter, and you're like, Carly, isn't this just like yeast? It's not. It is a live bacteria that feeds on the flour and water that you feed it. You can choose how often you feed it. If you were to leave it out on the counter, you'd have to feed it daily. The temperature in the air and how fast it feeds through all the flour that you've given it, you have to feed it daily. But if you put it in the refrigerator, you can feed it weekly, which is generally what I do. I don't bake bread every day, but putting it in the fridge, I can bake every 3 days, every week, whenever I really feel like it. Now I will say, you're like, 1 week, that's kind of still feeling a little short to feed the sourdough. I have gone almost 3 weeks without feeding mine, and I did have to discard some on top that I wasn't sure of what it looked like, if it would be good. But it still came back to life very strong after 3 weeks. So I wouldn't suggest that, but I'd say you're definitely safe at 2 weeks. Another thing that you have to do is discard sourdough. Now I never actually discard any sourdough. What you do when you feed your sourdough is you split it in half and you feed half. You can actually feed both halves, and then you have 2 starters, which is great. You can gift one to friends, you can sell one, you can make more bread out of it, you can do whatever you want with that discard. But there is a difference between discard and active sourdough. Discard is actually going to be the sourdough that you haven't fed for a week. So if I wanted to go on Pinterest and find a sourdough recipe that is for discard, I would use this just how it is right now, not active. Once you feed your sourdough, then they refer to it as active sourdough. So now, when I got my Baker Creek sourdough starter, it gave me, we live in America, okay? It gave me cup measurements for the flour and water that I'm supposed to put in the sourdough starter. But I actually got the best results with my sourdough starter being strong and active when I actually weighed out my flour and water. So that is a suggestion for you. But if you don't have a scale, I would suggest that you actually fluff your flour and scoop it into your measuring cup so that way it's not compact and dense. So you're not actually putting a whole cup or maybe 500 grams of flour instead of trying to put 300. Alright, now one thing I did forget to mention is that you don't want to use tap water, anything that has chlorine in it. You want to use filtered water to make sourdough. You don't want anything that's going to affect the wild yeast in the sourdough starter. Alright, Now just to show you what I mean by fluffing your flour, this is brand like new flour. You can tell the container's full. But see how light and fluffy it is? What you would want to do if you didn't have a scale is to pour the flour in without trying to squish it in there. You don't want to pack it down. If you scoop it, so you see that air coming out, you're really packing it, so you're getting a lot more flour than you would if you just fluffed it and poured it in nicely. I'm a messy baker, so this is pretty normal. Alright, since I'm messy, I did find my apron and put that on, because the flour, I get it everywhere, as you can tell. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to split my sourdough starter in half. Now you can see how nice that looks. There's still bubbles from the last feeding. This is a really active, strong sourdough starter. Even though this is actually at the point where it's called discard, it's not active because it's gone through all of its food source. Once we feed it, it'll bubble up real strong. Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and mix the sourdough up, the starter up, because if there was any liquid separation in it, this would be the time where you would see it and save yourself the hassle of not getting good sourdough starter. But what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna split this in half, which is discarding half of my sourdough, but I'm not actually discarding it. Mine's really thick today. It's usually not this thick, but we'll take it, I guess. You do not have to weigh what you're doing either at this point. You're just kind of splitting it, eyeballing it to be about half, because obviously this is weighing the container as well. But I just wanted to make sure that I was discarding about 100 grams of discard at least, because a lot of recipes take a cup, half a cup, which equates to about 100 grams usually for starter. So I just wanted to make sure I had that much for making a different recipe. Alright, so now this is the discard. This you could feed to make into another active sourdough starter and gift it to somebody. But for me, I'm probably going to be making a discard recipe. I like to make tortillas, and my husband likes it too. So I will be putting this in the fridge and saving that for later. Okay, now I'm going to feed the sourdough starter. Make sure that you zero out your scale so you know how much you're putting in. Depending on how much sourdough starter you use and how much you have present, you can feed it 50 grams of each, water and flour, or you can feed it 100 grams. I'm going to be feeding it 50, and I might be adding a little bit of water because you saw how thick mine had gotten. So I'm just going to mess around with it a little bit till I like the consistency, but I would definitely stick to the 50 grams for yours. Definitely until you get more comfortable with changing your sourdough starter and as you get used to using it. Alright, my scale is at 0. I'm going to go ahead and do the 50 grams of water. My tip to you would be once you get close to 50 on your, or 40, 45, that you slow down. Because look at that, it went from 43 all the way to 47. If you can't see it, just take my word for it. So I'm going to very slowly trickle in the water. Oh, see, I went over. But the nice thing is, well, I'm going to use this one because I've already made a mess for doing dishes, is you can scoop some out. And then my scale, it might just be finicky a little bit. See, because if I lifted it up, put it back on, it was actually at 50 now. That is one trick, is you can kind of, if you don't mix them in right away, is you're able to scoop some out. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same with the flour, zero it out, and get to 50. Got to 50 on each. Now I'm actually going to take the scale out and I'm going to mix it with my fork. The reason that I am feeding the sourdough starter in the evening is because I want the sourdough starter to be at its most active in the morning when I'm going to start making my loaf of bread. So making sourdough is a little bit of a longer process, but it is well worth it for my health benefits. So this is it for now. This is a fed sourdough. I really need to clean my bowl. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cover it to make sure that no other like dust or dog hair gets in here, because we know we have a lot of that around here. Thanks, Hunter. But that is it for tonight. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it out. I'm not going to put it in the fridge for the evening. And then tomorrow morning it will be ready to go to make our sourdough loaf. Alright, today is the next day and the starter is active. I just did a floating test to test it out and I'll insert that here. Real quick, I wanted to show you guys this. I had actually never done it before, but this is what you would call the float test. You would put a little bit of sourdough starter into some water to see if it floats, to tell if you have an active starter or not. And I actually did this a minute ago and I was like, oh, I should have recorded this and told you guys about it. But this shows that I have a nice active starter to start our bread today. But what we're going to actually do, the recipe that I'm going to share in the link below actually says to put some, like, a certain amount of sourdough starter in a cup and feed that for this recipe in the morning. But I'm just going to go ahead and weigh out my active starter dough how I normally do it. I had my scale at 0, so make sure you put your scale at 0. A lot of people like to use like a square container, purely because then you can see how much your loaf is rising. But I have always just worked kind of with what I got. Oh. Now this only takes about 50 grams for one loaf it takes about 50 grams. And I only have one Dutch oven. So that's all I'm going to be making today is one. Especially since we are moving, I don't want to put a whole bunch in the freezer, otherwise I would go ahead and make 2. Once you have your sourdough starter weighed out to 50 grams, go ahead and zero out your scale again. And then you're going to add 350 grams of water. Now if you don't have a scale again, in the recipe in the link below, there is cup measurements for this recipe. I'm sorry. In the description below, if you don't have a scale, there is a measurements if you just have measuring cups. That bottle got me just shy of the 350, so I'll be right back. Okay, so I am really close to 350, so I just want to go ahead and do this very slowly. Oh, and I got a little bit too much, so I'm just going to use my spoon to scoop it out. Again, I showed you yesterday that sometimes that last gram doesn't come up until you lift it and place it again, and then it recognizes it. So just be very careful when you're doing measurements. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to stir the sourdough starter into this water, just to kind of evenly displace it, so that way when we mix the flour in, it's not just one big old clump that the sourdough starter's in, so it doesn't rise unevenly. Now again, we are going to zero out our scale and we are going to measure the flour into it. Now in the beginning I do just kind of scoop the flour in because I have to get 500 grams of flour in here. So it does take a little bit of flour, so you don't have to quite be cautious until you get close to that 500 mark, just like most of the rest of the measurements. One of the steps that makes this beginner sourdough loaf is that we put in the salt now. Now if you're a professional baker, you probably aren't going to put the salt now because this is the auto-lease stage of sourdough making, which we won't go into in this video, but it is a more advanced sourdough starter term. That way we can just do it all in one fell swoop. I'm at 498, so just need a little bit. It didn't change. 499. Oh, 500. Got to 500. So now if you want to, you can go ahead and zero out your scale to put in the salt, but it's only 10 grams, so I don't ever really feel the need to zero it out. You do want to be careful though, because now that we have flour in here, it wouldn't be easy to scoop out salt, really. And you don't want to make your bread too salty, but you absolutely don't want to forget the salt, because bread's just not good without a little salt. Still saying 509. Must be real close. 510. There we go. There you have it, folks. Alright. So now that all of our ingredients are in here, you can use your spoon, fork, whatever you want, your hands, stiff spatula to mix this together. I just already made a fork messy, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the fork. You do not need your scale anymore, so you can go ahead and take that away so it's a little easier to mix on. But you just start mixing, and what you're going for is sort of a shaggier dough. You're not really kneading this. This isn't a kneading recipe either. We're trying to make this as simple as we can on ourselves. We just want to soak up all of the flour and the water. And then once it gets to a certain point, I do just kind of use my hands to squish it around so I can soak up more of the flour at the bottom. Sometimes you gotta scrape a little bit on the edges. Like I said, I'm a messy baker, so I'm not afraid of the hands being doughy, but you can go ahead and wet your hands or flour your hands so it doesn't quite stick to it as much. But once you have this a little bit shaggier dough, all you're going to do is let this rest for an hour. I'm going to cover it with a clean towel or beeswax, whatever you have, and we'll put it to rest. Now it's just going to sit aside while I go ahead and clean. And we'll be back with you in an hour. Alright friends, it has been an hour. So now what we're going to do is stretch and fold it. And you're going to do that 4 times, basically turning your bowl every time you stretch and fold. Now you can see it's gotten a little wetter. So we're going to stretch. I'm really bad at this, sorry. Stretch and fold. And it gets a little harder every time you stretch and fold it, just because it it formed more gluten. Stretch and fold. I should have got my hands wet because that's what they suggest for stretching and folding. Ooh, I think I went one too many, didn't I? But anyways, now we're actually going to do that process a total of 3 times. So that was the first time. And what we're going to do is we're going to cover the bowl back up, set it aside for 30 more minutes. And we'll do that 2 more times. So that way we get a nice airy sourdough. And then after we fold 2 more times, then we'll let it rest and do its big rise. Alright friends, this is actually ready for its bulk rise, which is about a rest. What you're looking for is about 7 to 10 hours. You're trying to get it to be 50% bigger. Not double, but 50%. If it was doubling, then it overproofed. It does depend on the temperature of your space, about how long it takes. We'll check back on it in 7 hours. Alright, we are ready for our next step, which is going to be folding and shaping the dough. One way that you can tell the dough is ready is that if you are able to poke it and it doesn't completely get rid of the shape that you poked it, but it slowly rises out. If it doesn't rise out at all, it's overproofed. If it springs back super fast, it's underproofed. So this is the perfect consistency that we want. So we are going to very, very lightly just flour a clean work surface, and we're going to get the dough out. Now I kind of just use like a scraping motion because the dough is sticky on the sides of the bowl. So we're going to stretch the dough a little bit and fold it over. Just kind of do that the 4 times like we did in the bowl beforehand. And then we're actually going to turn it seam side down, and we're going to like roll and fold, kind of like a pinching motion almost, to get it to roll into a really nice tight texture on the top. Then we are going to put that into a parchment paper that we're going to use as a sling. The crease side down, and we're going to put it in a clean bowl and let it rest for 30 minutes to an hour. Once you hit that 30-minute mark, or even if you wanted to do it right away, like if it's warm outside, you can just preheat your oven right away to 450 degrees. And what you would do is take your Dutch oven and go ahead and put it in the oven. Since it's winter here right now, or fall, I am going to wait 30 minutes before preheating my oven, and then once my oven is preheated, we'll be putting the bread in. Hey guys, just a quick interjection here while we're waiting for the oven to preheat to bake our sourdough. Yay! A few things I wanted to talk about. Scoring your sourdough. Now I know that there's tons of pretty fancy designs that are on Pinterest that you can try on your sourdough, and I encourage you to try whatever you want. But I just want to let you know that it doesn't take any fancy tools. You can use just a sharp knife or even a razor blade. I prefer a razor blade. It just makes the cuts really clean, but it is dangerous, so don't let anyone young try it out without adult supervision. And then also just be careful yourself, so that way you don't cut yourself. I'm known as a klutz, so it's generally a step that Christian doesn't like to watch happen. But today I will probably be just doing a simple score, so that way you can see what it would look like for your first time. Another thing that we can discuss is how to store your sourdough. You can store your bread in storage bags, just like this one. I got this one at a arts and crafts show, and it's called Eco Baguette Reusable Bread Bag from Green City Living. So if I do find them online, I'll try to put a link down below. They did come with this bag, a bread stone that you soak to help keep your bread moist, and then also 2 different closures, which I just go ahead and use both when I'm doing my bread making. This currently has half a loaf for Christian's breakfasts right now. You can also use beeswax wrap. I've seen people where they'll put it cut side face down on a cutting board and put a cake topper on top. Whatever you prefer to do to store your bread is the way you should go. I don't suggest refrigerating it. That seems to really dry it out and make it hard. So we don't want that. We want it to still be soft with a nice crust. So if you want to freeze the whole loaf, go ahead and wrap it tightly and freeze the whole loaf. If you'd like to freeze it in slices, I would recommend wrapping individually each slice very tightly, maybe once with saran wrap and then once with foil, just to contain the moisture in the bread still. But that should give you some nice bread that you can use in the future. So we are about ready to bake our bread. Now with baking our bread, what we're going to do is we have the Dutch oven actually heating up in the oven while it preheats. That way the Dutch oven is already up to temperature before even putting the dough in it. That's where that handy dandy parchment paper sling comes in handy. So just make sure that you have really nice oven mitts, or just to be very aware when you're using a Dutch oven, because it is heavier, it's really hot, it can burn you, and it can be difficult to handle. You might have just heard it ding, but it's ready to go. Alright, so we're going to get the Dutch oven out, and we are going to actually put our bread in. But first, we need to score it. For scoring, there's lots of different methods you can do. I'm just going to go ahead and score this one down the middle, just to make it really simple and easy. We're going to take our razor, and we are going to just slice it down the middle. If you do need to cut it once or twice, that's okay. You make it however deep you would like it, but you see how clean of a line that opens up for us. Okay, I got my oven mitts. I'm going to go ahead and get the Dutch oven out, and I'm going to put it on the stove, transfer the sourdough into it, and go ahead and put it back in the oven. And we actually want to put the lid on and bake it covered for 20 minutes. And then after that 20 minutes, I'll take the lid out, and you want to bake it for 25 to 30 minutes depending on how brown you want your crust. Woo! Almost made a mistake there. Don't forget to start your timer. Alright, timer just went off, so we're going to go ahead and uncover it and cook it for 25 to 30 more minutes. Alright, sourdough's done. So what you're going to want to do is lift it out by the sling you created with the parchment paper and put it onto a wire rack to let it cool for about 1 to 2 hours. And during this time period, it will still be cooking on the inside, so you don't want to cut it too soon because otherwise you'll have a mushy middle, which is what we're trying not to have. We want it nice, bubbly, firm, but still soft on that inside. And that is it. There's your sourdough loaf. Just let it cool and then choose your storage preference that we talked about earlier. We will probably be actually freezing this loaf and trying it out, and we will let you know how that goes. Thank you for hanging out with us at BlossomAcresHomestead. And if you'd like to get more sourdough videos or garden videos, go ahead and subscribe and give us a like, and we will keep doing what we're doing. Catch of the year.